The United States Federal Reserve's monetary system has no reverse gear, and in the absence of a recession, America's strong economy supports and creates prosperity for much of the world. But what happens when a U.S. recession or depression interrupts the U.S. monetary system? Artificially created bubbles like the housing market, for example, collapse. And without government bailouts, another economic disaster makes U.S. history. In this video, I interview CEO of Santiago Capital, Brent Johnson. Brent is the author of the dollar milkshake theory, where he believes in a currency collapse. However, until this happens, he believes that the U.S. dollar will strengthen significantly against other world currencies. In this video, you'll hear Brent's thoughts on asset bubbles, timelines, and what Americans should be doing now to prepare for a potential collapse of the middle class. I hope you enjoy this video, and if you do, please share it with your family and friends. Brent, man, it's so good to sit down with you. You know, I'm so excited for this interview because you're probably, to me, one of the smartest guys on a macroeconomic level as far as your knowledge, and not so much domestically, but globally, as far as, swap lines. I'm excited to get into some of this stuff. Yeah. We're going to probably have to ask you to, put it in layman's terms a little bit for, people like me. My audience may be a little more smarter than me when it comes to the macroeconomics. But as you know, I'm in the housing market, and we're in kind of a tough spot right now. But I'm excited to get started here. So why don't you just tell everybody, for those that don't know who you are, give us the 50,000 foot view.
Well, thanks for having me. First of all, I appreciate you inviting me. I appreciate the nice things you said. Hopefully I can live up to those. We'll have to see how that goes. But long story short, I have a company called Santiago Capital, and my job is to manage money of other people. And I manage money for individuals, not big institutions, not big endowments or pension funds. And so the people, my clients on the other side of the table, are not other professionals in the money management business. And so when I talk to them, I talk in layman's terms, because they might not know what a swap line is. They might not know what interest rate policy is. And so I've always tried to use somewhat simple narratives or analogies in order to explain kind of what I think's going on. And my management style is very much macro-based. Details are important, but I'm not much of a details guy. Once it gets down to the nitty-gritty details, I have people that help me with it. But I've always been a big picture guy. I've always been a big somebody who was interested in what's going on in the world, and different factors, whether it's news, sports, economics, politics, and macro investing is kind of like where all that kind of stuff meets. So that's who I am. That's what I do.
Well, you were in finance back in the 2008 global financial crisis. Did you work at Lehman Brothers, speaking in layman terms?
I wasn't at Lehman Brothers, but I was at Credit Suisse.
Okay.
And they didn't go bankrupt in 2008, but they finally went bankrupt earlier this year.
Okay,
so,
I got you.
But I was part of the traditional Wall Street path for, call it 10 years. And, coming out of the crisis I was very fortunate. I had a very fortuitous meeting in 2007 prior to the crash, which kind of opened my eyes a little bit. So I was kind of ready for it. I wasn't smart enough to figure out all the banks were going to fail. I just knew something bad was going to happen. And coming out of the financial crisis, I decided I didn't want to be part of traditional Wall Street anymore. And I left Credit Suisse, and I went and joined a friend of mine who had his own independent firm. And that kind of parlayed into me having my own firm. So it's been a little bit of a journey. And it's about every 4 or 5 years in my career, there's a crisis. So
what was more stressful, Wall Street or what you're doing now?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. I would say initially, Wall Street was, because I had to build my own business, and you basically eat what you kill. And that's kind of a layman's way of saying, you get paid on commission, you don't get paid
like
on
real estate.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You don't get a salary. And when I started, it was right during the dot-com boom, and then we had the dot-com crash. And so from 2001 to 2004, we were kind of in a bear market, and trying to build an investing business coming out of a crisis in a bear market. Prices were good. If I could get clients to put money to work, prices were good, but it was tough to build a business in that environment. But fortunately, I was able to do it.
Speaking of crisis, a lot of people think that we're in a crisis right now. I mean, as you know, home sales are really down. nationwide, stateside. We're in Puerto Rico now, so but when we're talking stateside, maybe it's the same here. But we are really watching things kind of deteriorate. But it's on a much more macro level. It's not just the housing market. It's the banking crisis. It's a mess. And, I can remember back in 2008, meeting with other business owners. We were all really struggling back then. Real estate, restaurant, it didn't matter what business you were in. You were struggling back in the 2008 crisis. But I took a deep dive into panics, recessions, depressions throughout U.S. history. And it was interesting because they're nothing new. I mean, no. The difference is from 1785, I think it was, really all the way up until 1913, before they passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and then even beyond that, these depressions, recessions happened every 2 to 5 years. It wasn't really until we got into, I think, maybe 1980s to where we started seeing them start spanning over 10-year periods. You know more than me. I mean, so if we went back to Paul Volcker's day, right? I think, what was he in, 1979, maybe somewhere around there.
Yep.
And that's when we started to see Fed policy showing up more. And why is that? I mean, why did things? Yeah. It was almost like they worked themselves out back then until the Fed got more involved, and then they kicked the can down the road. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair. I would say that Volcker, and this is fairly widely known. This isn't some deep insight on my part, but Volcker was kind of the last central banker to take away the punch bowl. He took interest rates from, let's call it 6 or 7% to 18 or 19% over a 4-year period. And he did that to dramatically crush the inflation that everybody remembers from the 70s. I was a kid back in the 70s, but I can kind of remember on the shopping bags, it was printed like the inflation buster. And, you had to get inflation down, and inflation was kind of everywhere. And so he was tasked with getting it down come what may. And, he ultimately did that. Wall Street didn't believe he would do it, but he did. He kept taking interest rates higher, and he finally broke the back of inflation. What I think is perhaps a little bit underappreciated is that that's also about the time that the whole global economy started to become more of a global economy as opposed to a national economy. Now, there was always business done between different countries, but that's when everything kind of really started to get really not coordinated, but more commingled. Right? It used to be that you could have a crisis in England and it might affect the United States, or you could have problems in Asia and it might affect the U.S. a little bit, but you could also kind of insulate yourself from it a little bit. Those days are largely gone. They're not completely gone, but they're largely gone. And now, markets are so connected that a problem in Thailand ends up showing up in the United States, or vice versa. And so I think Volcker, when he took rates that high, then they started coming down, and they came down for 40 years. Now there was brief periods of times where they went up, but generally, we've all heard the story. Oh, when I bought my first house in 1976, the mortgage rate was 18% or whatever it was, right?
Heard it all the time.
And now people are, they have 3% mortgages or 4% mortgages now. This year, now they're 7 or 8% mortgages, but 4 or 5 years ago, that wasn't uncommon to hear that. We have now, so the pendulum, was with Volcker clear up, the mortgage rates are 18 or 19%. And now it's swung all the way back to 3% or 2% or 4%, whatever it is. And now it's starting to swing back. Now, and it's this swinging back that the central bankers, the monetary authorities, they're trying to fight against that to a certain extent. They're trying to kick the can down the road, because as interest rates come up with all the debt in the world, we get the crisis. And because the crisis isn't local, it gets spread globally. They don't want that.
You touched on something that in 1982, before 1982, we did a lot of manufacturing here in the U.S. Right? I mean, I also grew up at the same time as you, and I was a kid in the 70s, and I graduated in 86 high school. But I can remember the stamp of Made in the USA was on so much, right? And when I read about that, I think it was in 1982, only 1 in 4 jobs, manufacturing jobs, were offshore. Over the next however many period, but by the time we got to 2000, and I think this is a problem with wage growth, while we haven't seen it, we lost 4 million manufacturing jobs in a very short period of time, and 40% of our manufacturing labor was taken offshore. We've seen wage growth, I think, from 1982 to 2000, I think it went up 17%, relatively speaking, and housing went up over 300%. Do you think there's a correlation between?
Oh yeah. Yeah. This is all related, and it's very hard to tell the story because there's so many different pieces, and it's really hard to pick where it started. Actually, before Volcker, but not dramatically. So early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. I don't remember the exact year. I want to say it was 71 or so. Nixon went to China, right? And that was a big thing when Nixon went to China. He was the first American president to visit, communist China. And that was kind of the thawing of the U.S.-Sino relationships. And that kind of started the kickoff to, opening China's markets up and exporting our manufacturing jobs over there. And if you remember, during the 80s, Japan became a manufacturing powerhouse and an economic powerhouse, and they were going to take over the world. I don't, as a real estate guy, you might know this better than I do, but at one point, the Imperial Palace in Japan was worth more than all of California or something like that. Prices had just gone crazy.
Like 100-year mortgages or something stupid.
Yeah. So
crazy.
But again, this is all part of the globalization of the world economy, as opposed to just having separate domestic economies. And so at the same time that interest rates were going from, again, high teens to low single digits, you had jobs being exported overseas, and so you've got jobs. You've got interest rates, and the third thing is currency. In 1973 was the oil embargo. And so if you remember in 72, Nixon cut the gold standard, the link between the dollar and gold.
Glass-Steagall Act.
No, that was investment banking, and that goes back to the 1930s.
Okay.
That's the delineation between investment banking and commercial banking.
Okay.
But what he cut was the gold convertibility to the dollar. It used to be that other countries that did business with the United States and got dollars could turn them back in to the government, U.S. government, and get gold in exchange. But France kept asking for the gold, and Nixon got tired of giving it to them, so he cut the linkage, and he said, we will no longer exchange our dollars for gold. So that caused a mini currency crisis. The way the U.S. solved that currency crisis was they convinced Saudi Arabia to price all their oil in dollars. And because the whole world needed oil to run their economies, because oil is energy is needed to do any kind of work. Nobody's economy could run without oil. Now the fact that everybody had to buy oil but needed dollars to do it gave quasi-backing to the dollar where the gold backing no longer existed.
Wow, that
seemed
pretty smart to me. I mean, that's
it was touch and go for a while, but they had the U. But and so
at the time,
and what did Saudi Arabia get in exchange? So it's a two-way thing, and a lot of people think this was a gift to the United States, and it was, and I'm not denying that it was. But Saudi Arabia got something out of it too. What they got is, you got to remember, it was largely a desert kingdom, and I'm not saying that to be, speaking down about them. That's just a fact. It wasn't a highly technological society at the time. But the House of Saud, the king came from the Saud family. He had other factions within Saudi Arabia who wanted to run Saudi Arabia. So what the United States did, it said, you price your oil in dollars. We will protect you. We will make sure your family stays on the throne. And we will help you develop your country into a modern day society. And so over the last 40, 50 years, Saudi Arabia has become one of the most advanced societies in the world, has the highest standard of living in the world, and that family has stayed in power during that time. So it was mutually And if Saudi Arabia had not, if they had said no, then the U.S. would have had an enemy. Now, who really wanted to fight the U.S. back in the 70s, right? Probably didn't. I mean, we had nuclear weapons. We were the global superpower. It would have been touch and go. And Saudi Arabia did not want an enemy of the United States. So it was kind of a win-win for everybody.
Wow.
And so this is important. That backing of oil with dollars, or backing of dollars with oil, however you want to say it, it cemented the dollar as the global reserve currency. It meant the whole world needed dollars. And since the whole world needed dollars, they started saving in dollars.
And that bumped us up.
And they started saving in dollars, and they started borrowing in dollars, and that solidified the dollar on the global market, which became the euro dollar market.
That's amazing. I mean, we could, that in itself could be a whole show, because that puts a whole new light on, I don't want to go down that road, but 9/11.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's something completely, wow, that's mind blowing.
Well, it again, without getting into it, helps explain why we let these Saudi Arabian nationals fly home on
right
9/12.
That's what I'm talking about.
Right?
Yeah.
And and even a couple of years ago, they did another investigation, and all these senators went in and read this classified report, and they came out and said, if we ever publicize this,
wow,
this would change Saudi Arabian and United States relationships, and that's why it's classified. And it's a big deal. I mean, that's the simplest way to say it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think the motivation was in offshoring our manufacturing? I mean, it seems, I get the concept. They said, well, we can offshore and provide revenue, right, from importing, but also we can reduce the costs for the American people. I mean, that hurt us, but I don't know that we ever saw that reduction. And they say that we can't bring the excuse of we can't onshore manufacturing now because it would cost so much. How can it cost much? And where's the money going? So
there's a couple speeches. If people are interested in this, there's a couple speeches I would point people to, and that is, I think it was I might be right. It was either 1990 or 1994 when Ross Perot ran for president.
I remember that.
And he spoke about this a lot. And he talked about how the giant sucking sound taking United States manufacturing over to China. And so you can probably find those speeches on YouTube. And there's another guy from Great Britain called Sir James Goldsmith, who basically, I think he was on Charlie Rose. I don't remember for sure, but I think he was on Charlie Rose. And he basically laid it out in painstaking detail exactly what was going to happen. That, in short term, this is going to lead to corporate profits. Prices will come down and profits will go up. Stock market will boom. But after that short-term high wears off, it's going to lead to massive medium and long-term problems. And he couldn't have called it any more perfectly, because this is exactly what has happened. I think he called it the hollowing out of America. And that's kind of what's happened. And so now we're in this situation. So think about it. For 40 years, let's just use 40 as the number, from 1980 to 2020, you had globalization. The world is working together more. They're coordinating. They're cooperating. So think of it as expansion. Well, now you've got the world fracturing. They're no longer, we've got Russia versus the United States, China versus the United States, global South versus the Western society, the BRICS countries versus America. So, you've got this kind of what's going on in the Middle East now, who knows where that goes. So you've got this fracturing global market where they're no longer coordinating, they're no longer communicating as effectively. And so now, whereas the United States outsourced their supply chain, now they have to try to find a different placement, because it's a national security risk to outsource your supply chain to China. And so I think a lot of times people will paint this, well, China holds all the cards. Well, no, China has problems too, because China owes a lot in US dollar debt. Their biggest customer is the United States. If we go away, who are they going to sell to? Oh, then people say, well, they have a lot of people. They could sell internally. They could sell internally, but not at the same prices they're selling to us, right?
Yeah.
And because they've borrowed so much debt, if their revenue is now 20% of what it was last year, how do they service all that debt? So it's a problem for everybody, and everybody's trying to figure it out. But that's what we have. Again, we had cooperation and expansion, and now we've got fracturing and contraction. And in my opinion, the dollar sits at the center of all of it because of what we just talked about and how the dollar and euro dollar market developed.
Yeah. So how bad is our debt crisis?
It's bad. It's bad. But when I say that, I say it kind of laughingly because if you don't laugh, you cry. But the other part of it is it's not a uniquely American situation. And what I mean by that is the U.S., I think a lot of people have heard the $33 trillion number. We've borrowed $33 trillion and it's going up, a couple trillion every year, 2 or 3 trillion every year. And we're running $1 trillion budget deficits, not billion, trillion. And just for some reference, do you know how old you would be if you lived to be 1 trillion seconds?
No.
32,000 years old.
Okay.
So that's how big
a big number.
That's how big a trillion
Right.
is. So these are mind-boggling numbers. And so it'll be really, really hard to ever pay off that debt. And the reality is it will never be paid off. It will either be defaulted on or inflated away. And so when people do those, when you analyze the United States and the debt that we have, there is no conclusion you can come to other than we are in big, big trouble. The problem is when people come to this conclusion, they come to this conclusion because they analyze the United States in a vacuum, in isolation. But as I explained, we no longer have an isolated economy. It's a global economy. And when you look at the United States in conjunction with all the other countries, and when you do the same level analysis on the other individual countries as you do on the United States, you realize that they're in just as much trouble as we are. And in many cases, more trouble than we are. Because while we have all these problems, we also have several advantages that the rest of the world just doesn't have. Whether we deserve to have these or not, we could probably talk about that for 5 hours. But the fact is we do have them. And those advantages are huge compared to what the other countries have to work with. And so while I think we're going to have a crisis and it's going to be a global crisis, I actually think the U.S. is in a better position to deal with it than the rest of the world. Now, I want to be clear. That doesn't mean we're in good position.
Yeah.
This is a relative thing here. And the analogy I've used is, well, if you were a kid in the 70s and the 80s, you probably remember Hagler versus Hearns.
Of course.
Great boxing match, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So in the very first round, Marvin Hagler got punched right in the nose, right in the eye. His eye that was bleeding. They almost had to stop the fight because the cut on his eye was so big. Somehow his corner got the blood to stop. They went out there, fought another couple rounds, and Hagler won. And so the point I use is it's not that the U.S. won't get hurt in this fight. We're probably going to get punched pretty hard, probably going to bleed, and probably going to hurt. But I think we'll win. And when I say win, it's a very subjective term, but I think we are better positioned to handle what's coming than any other country I can find. And so, I don't want this to be a Pollyannish view. We got some big, big challenges. But I think a lot of times when people do this analysis and come to the conclusion that the U.S. just can't possibly continue to function as it has, I think they're doing themselves a disservice by analyzing it in isolation.
Brent, you've been quoted for saying that our monetary policy has no reverse gear. And that if we have a recession, it will wreck us. And over the last year, I mean, has been a lot of debate over, are we in a recession? Are we not in a recession? Do we redefine recession? But I think as we are now looking at the writing clearly on the wall, I think we're going into a recession. Could you kind of explain what you mean by no reverse gear?
Yeah. So when I made that quote, that was probably 10 years ago at this point when I initially said it. It's basically a way to explain the way the monetary system works. So if you give me 1 or 2 minutes, I'll, very simple terms, explain how the monetary system works, because it's important to understand that. The way the monetary system works is there is a monetary base. That's called base money. So the base money is literally the currency and coins we walk around with in our pockets. And then it's the reserves, the savings, for lack of a better word, that the banks put with the Federal Reserve. If you add those two together, you get approximately $4 or $5 trillion. All the other money that exists in the world is loaned into existence using that 4 or 5 trillion as the collateral. So what that means is if you have if M2, which is another measure of money, is 20 trillion, then that means there's 4 or 5 trillion of base money, and then it's levered up 4 times, right? So there's a leverage ratio there of like 400%. And that works. That's the way the whole world works. It's not just England does the same, European Union does the same, China does that. That's just the way it's a debt-based monetary system. But let's think about this. So let's pretend in this room, this is the whole world. There's no place else. And we've got 5 trillion of base money, and then we make 15 trillion in loans, right? We fast forward a year. We need new money to pay the interest because there's interest on loans, right? So where does that money come from? Well, there's only 2 places it can come from. Either the money has to be circulating fast enough that $1 can pay more than $1 of interest, right? Or somebody has to come in and put new money into the system, or increase the amount of collateral so that the system stays in balance. And that's where the Fed comes in. So when you get into a recession, so when money is being created, new loans are being created, new money is being created. So when somebody takes out a mortgage, they have a new debt, but there's also, let's say they buy $1 million house. The bank gives them $1 million. Now they have $1 million loan debt, but there's also a new $1 million that's in the economy that wasn't there yesterday, right? And as long as people are buying houses and buying refrigerators and flying on airplanes to go on vacation and putting gas in their car, that those dollars are circulating. That's the velocity of money. And as long as that's happening at a speed high enough to serve all the interest payments, everything's fine. But this is the problem with the reverse gear, is when money stops circulating, there is no reverse gear, because the reverse gear causes those loans to start defaulting. And then just like in 2008, when you had one default, it led to another default, it led to another default, and then you get a contraction or a crash. And so that's what I mean by the system doesn't have a reverse gear. In other words, for our economy to continue to function, it has to grow. And that is a function of the design of the system. Now, some people will say that's a design flaw. Other people will say they purposefully did it like that because there's a group at the top that can skim off the top, and they can, they can benefit from all of the pain of others. And when when it's time for the bailouts, those who took all the risk and lost all the money, they get bailed out at the expense of everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, what a great system that is for them.
Right. But that is the system. That is the way it is. By the way, again, that's not just a U.S. system. That's that way everywhere.
And in its cycle, we're watching. You say that expansion. If we don't have wage growth, it's kind of hard to have sustainable expansion. So what's going to happen? I mean, we kind of have an everything bubble.
Yeah.
The housing market's a bubble. If I look at the job market, and people will disagree with this, but as an employer that writes paychecks, and I have for almost 35 years, labor's a big expense for a company. And what we just went through with COVID and stimulus is it allowed these companies to hire away for higher money because the demand was so great. So they were paying those bonuses, those higher wages and things like that. But now that things are contracting for the businesses, the first thing that they're looking at and analyzing is one of the most expenses on their balance sheet or on their income expense statement, and that's labor.
Yep.
We've seen an automotive bubble, a stock market bubble. I mean, we're kind of like, do you agree we're in like an everything bubble?
I do. And so here's what I think's happening. A lot of people will say that people who run the government and run the central banks are a bunch of morons or a bunch of idiots, or they're clueless. And I completely understand that argument. And it's in many ways, it's hard to argue against that. People at the top of those, I don't think they're stupid people. I don't think you get into a position like that by being stupid. They may be misguided. They may be wrong. They may be arrogant, but I don't think they're stupid. I think
are they benefiting?
I think they have benefited for the last 40 years, but I think that they know that they either have to figure out a way to kick the can down the road to the next guy.
There's no reverse gear.
Right, because there's no reverse gear. Or they have to deal with the no reverse gear. And what I think is happening, and this is what many people disagree with me on this, and I don't know for sure that this is the case, but I do know that the reason that the U.S. raised interest rates last year was because they are purposefully trying to slow the economy. I'll make this point, and then we're going to have to go back for a minute to explain why we got to where we're at right now. But Powell, who is the head of the Federal Reserve, took interest rates from 0 to 5.5% in 18 months. It's unprecedented. It makes
never happened before.
It makes Volcker look like a kid at a candy at a picnic, rather than he was long talked about as the only central banker who would ever do this. Well, Powell has done it. Now, whether he gets away with it, that's another question. When I say that, get away with it without some kind of a disaster. Volcker was able to do it without creating a disaster. He created a recession, but he didn't create a disaster, or at least not directly. And so I think that the Fed realized that we were going to have a problem. They had to deal with the inflation that came as a result of all the COVID stimulus. And I think that he realized he could kill two birds with one stone. And what I mean by that is, by increasing interest rates, he can combat inflation. Whether he can actually fix it, that's a whole other story, but he can at least combat inflation. And I think it's fair to say that over the last 2 years, inflation maybe is not crashing, but it's not going up at the same rate it was. And I think he's trying to do a controlled demolition of the system. Mm-hmm. Remember I said, there's no reverse gear?
Yeah.
Well, if it's just left to run wild, it will eventually crash on its own. And I think he's kind of saying, well, if we're going to crash, I'm going to run the car in the ditch, but at least I got my hands on the wheel and I can kind of control the crash. And I think they know that if we have this crash, it doesn't just hurt the United States, it hurts the rest of the world as well. And while it may send the United States into a recession, it's going to put China in the morgue, so to speak. It's like that old thing from the Outsiders, or from the Untouchables. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. When Volcker was the chairman, we didn't have the consumer debt that we have now. So I look at it as it's a lot easier to not crash the system and, raise rates, cause a recession when we're not buried in credit card debt and student loan debt. We didn't have any. I mean, it was non-existent, really, wasn't it, back then?
No. Well, this is my point. Is I don't think he's stupid, but I think he may be misguided, and I think he may be arrogant. I think he may think he can steer this into the ditch. Powell. Yeah. Without a complete disaster. And that's where I say, again, I don't think he's stupid, but I don't know that he's as great a driver as he thinks he is. Yeah.
Well, you believe strongly in the dollar. And I want you to talk about the dollar milkshake theory. And I know, you're probably wondering, is he going to ask me about that? Because you probably said it a million times. There are a lot of people that believe that the dollar is going to just tank and crash. And I've referenced this a lot of times. I'm not saying I'm a Dave Ramsey fan at all. I respect the man. But I was listening to one of his podcasts, and a caller called in, and my audience has heard this a dozen times. And the caller said, you got to buy gold. You got to buy gold because the dollar's going to crash. And Dave Ramsey said, if the dollar crashes, you need bullets, not gold, right? I mean, that's great. But you think that eventually, maybe not in our lifetime, but eventually we are going to see a massive currency crisis, right? But you think that the dollar will remain strong. And I've heard you talk about it. Hey, when it hits, when people get into financial hard times, they sell their gold to put dollars in their pocket because that's their confidence, because it worked yesterday buying groceries, and they have confidence it's going to work tomorrow buying the same groceries. So the more dollar in their pocket, regardless of whether it's fraudulent paper or whatever you want to call it, right? I mean, you hear all kinds of things. But explain your dollar milkshake theory as it pertains to your belief of the dollar.
Okay, so I should probably tell people where I came up with the name. So if you probably noticed as we've been talking, I've referenced different historical things or movies, or I always try to use simple analogies. And I'm a big movie buff, and there's a movie called There Will Be Blood. And it
Great
stars,
movie, by the way.
It stars Daniel Day-Lewis, who's an oil, this ruthless oil executive, and he's negotiating a piece of property with his neighbor, and his neighbor really wants to sell the property. And so he says, come on, you buy my property and you get all the oil that's beneath it. And Daniel Day-Lewis says, I don't really have to buy your property because I can just stick a straw down on my side of the fence. I can suck up all your oil. And he says, I can drink your milkshake. Okay, so that's where I got the idea. But essentially, my point is that because the whole world is in this mess, because the whole world has the same type of a system, because the whole world has the same issues that the United States has as far as their currency potentially losing value, when they get into these messes, the way that they typically respond to it is they print money, provide stimulus, do bailouts, however you want to define that, right? They're essentially providing liquidity to the system to try to get it circulating again. We talked earlier, when it stops circulating, you get problems. So by them either recollateralizing, putting stimulus in, doing bailouts, they hope to get that circulation going again. And my belief is next time we get into this crisis, just like in 2020, the whole world responded. A lot of people will talk about how much the Fed did, and the Fed did a lot, don't get me wrong. But the ECB did a lot, the Bank of Japan did a lot, Australia, Canada, China, everybody did it. And my point is that that's the milkshake. That's the liquidity that the whole world is providing. But for many reasons, again, some deserved and some undeserved, the United States is the one that has the biggest straw. So when everybody's printing all that money or providing all that liquidity, the United States has this straw that sticks out there into the global economy, and it just sucks up that excess liquidity and it goes into the United States. And if you're going to invest in the United States, you need dollars to do it. And so, the first thing is it goes into the dollar, and then it maybe goes into stocks, or maybe it goes into bonds, or maybe it goes into real estate, or maybe it goes into commodities. And so, this is largely what we saw since 2008 until now, or even 2020 till now, or 2008 until now. I think a lot of people know that over that 15 or 20 years, the U.S. has done enormous stimulus. They've done enormous quantitative easing where they've provided funding to the banks. They've done a number of bailouts. Mortgages. Right? They bought mortgage-backed securities.
Dropped the interest rates.
That helped keep interest rate. That's how we get to those 3% mortgages, 2% mortgages. Right? Despite all of that they've done, since 2008, the dollar has risen 20%, the dollar index. That means versus its peer currencies, it's up 20%. So if printing money and doing the stimulus makes the currency fall, how is it possible that we've done all of that for the last 15 years and yet the dollar's up 20%? The reason is because currencies trade relative to each other, and the rest of the world had to do even more of it than we did. And so, about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was 2018, that's when that's the first time I mentioned the milkshake. And at the time I said, in the years ahead, we will end up having crises. I think it'll end up in a currency and debt crisis. And I said, and over that time period, the dollar will go higher, U.S. equities will go higher, and gold will go higher. I said, but there will be terrifying drawdowns along the way. And that's kind of exactly what's happened. If you just look at prices from 2018, the dollar's up a lot, U.S. equities are up a lot, gold's up a lot. But during that time period, there's been a couple times where it went up and it came down a lot, went up and came up, down a lot. And I think that pattern will probably continue to play out over the next 5 years. There will be times where the dollar is going up, and there will be times where it will be coming down. Same with U.S. equities, same with gold. But I think largely what happens is globally, fiat currency, paper currency will get debased against real things. And so, but the US dollar will get debased less than foreign currencies because there's so much demand for US dollars. Now, I can explain why that is in a second. But that is how you get a situation where the dollar rises versus all foreign currencies, but yet gold, real assets, maybe land, maybe real estate. Again, maybe real estate, it depends what interest rates are doing. That's how the US on a relative basis outperforms the rest of the world, because money gets funneled into the dollar and into the United States. And while things might be bad here, they'll be even worse elsewhere.
Well, I'm pretty bearish on the real estate market right now. and my livelihood depends on it. Do you think that we are going to see a major downturn in housing? I mean, do you think that's one of the retractions that you're talking about that will go up and come down? And I mean, I could point out a lot of different indicators. I mean, one, there are a lot of people that haven't been able to pay their mortgages, and without forbearance, they would have already been kicked out of their houses.
I think that's likely. I'm more bearish on commercial real estate than I am on residential, but I also understand. I know the commercial real estate market better than I do the single family home or first home market like you do. I think everything's going to come under pressure. So it's hard for me to single one out.
How soon? I mean, what are you thinking? I mean, we're in election year. We've got a battle of the egos going on right now.
That's the thing. And I am more concerned with a crisis happening overseas that bounces back and hits the United States than having it start in the United States and spread out.
Where's that concern? I mean, what do you think? War? I mean, what do you...
Well, I think wars... I mean, I always hate saying this because it makes me just sound uber bearish, but I think we're literally like in a Game of Thrones now where all the pieces are on the board. When every country's in trouble, they have to fight for their own survival, and they have to blame somebody else. The governments of the world cannot accept the blame for the condition they're in. They have to blame somebody else. So it's easier to blame the other political party or the other country, right? And that's how you get social strife within the country, and that's how you get geopolitical conflict between countries. And I think it's pretty easy to see that we're there now. Again, whether you're just talking the Middle East or U.S. Russia, U.S. China, even within Europe, there's factions that are not disagreeing with each other. And I think that's a natural. I think a big part of this goes back to the debt. Like when think about this. When things are going good and the economy's humming and everybody's making money, how it's so easy to overlook the little problems. Oh yeah, he shouldn't have done that, but
bigger problems.
We'll let it slide.
Yeah, we get bigger fish to fry, right?
Or we're just making so much money that you don't worry about the little problems.
Right.
It's like when you're on a sports team and you're winning. Oh yeah, that guy's kind of a jerk, but whatever, we're winning.
We won.
But as soon as you stop winning, as soon as you lose a few games and that guy's a jerk, you're like, we need to get rid of that guy, right? Or when you don't make as many sales as you used to, and that expense that you used to that guy was when he was expensing, steak dinners when he should have been. Now you're looking at that a little bit closer, right?
Right.
And so I think it's a function of the fact that economically we're not doing as well because of all the debt.
And now all these
other little problems that weren't problems before, now you're honing in on them a little bit more. And that festers, and eventually it explodes. And I think that's kind of where we're at. I think we're at the exploding stage.
Well, the commercial implosion, I think, is just beginning, and I'm seeing that show up with people that I know, clients, where they can't refinance their properties. The bank's not interested for whatever reason. Maybe it's a certain class that they no longer have an appetite for, and they want a lot of money. And the most vulnerable are the ones that sign personally.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Not the non-recourse guys that say, okay, fine, here's the keys, have it. You don't want to work with me. But when we talk about stimulus and getting back to no reverse gear and kind of, bringing this, landing the plane, bringing it home. And, we talk about residential real estate. The government is insuring so many loans.
A lot of it, and they will end up having to insure even more of it.
Well, what happens?
Okay, so
what happens when the people can't pay their mortgage? The forbearance programs, the bailouts have ended. They have to pay their mortgages this month, and they still can't.
Yeah.
And we look at it and we go, okay, if we have an asset here, an asset class, residential real estate, where we have all this debt, we allow these people to buy it with VA 0% down, USDA 0% down, 3% down, 3.5% down. We're not invested. There's no equity in some cases. And now all of a sudden we have a problem with people being able to default, just people starting to default on their loans. What does the government do at this point when this happens?
Okay, so this goes back to there is no reverse gear. They have to do something, because if they do nothing, the whole system will collapse on itself. That's just the design of the
banking system.
That's just the design of the system. And so that's why whenever whenever a government gets into this situation, they have to either save the bond market or the currency, because you can't save both, right? And the reason you can't save both is they're the opposite sides of the same coin. If everything starts to go bust, and governments, they have to start printing in order to fill the hole, then that has the potential to debase the currency. The reason that the US dollar has not been debased like many people have predicted is because there's a drain that most people don't even know exists. So let me explain. So you got into Puerto Rico a couple days ago, and we had a huge rainstorm last night, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So and so much so that the streets were flooding, right? Think of the regular water level as just the economy. And when rain comes in and builds up, that's inflation. So when you've got the economy out there, when the government starts printing money or throwing new money and the water bubbles over, that's inflation. But the reason that never really happened from 2008 until 2020, and the reason that the dollar has started to rebound and actually went up to a 30-year high last year, despite everything that they've done since 2008, is because while, they're putting more water in, there's a drain at the bottom of the pool that takes water away. And that drain that takes water away is the rest of the world. The rest of the world needs dollars as well. So when the U.S. prints dollars, they print for the United States, but it gets drained away to the euro dollar market. Remember, we talked about that euro dollar market. And
right.
The rest of the world owes 30 trillion as well. And the rest of the world needs dollars to function as well. So the U.S. pours it in. So if you have a swimming pool that's flat, and they start pouring water in, if there was no drain, it would overflow, and that would be inflation.
Yeah.
But that drain takes all that liquidity and takes it into the euro dollar market, which is even bigger than the U.S. market. And remember, all the other countries are doing this too, but they don't have the drain that goes out into the world. So they're printing for their domestic markets. We're printing for the whole world. So despite all this money we're printing, their swimming pool is overflowing quicker than our swimming pool. So they get the higher inflation than we do.
What happens to the bond market?
Well, if interest rates go up, then bond prices come down, right? And if interest rates go too much, then the bond market collapses. And if the bond market collapses, then how does the government get money? So they're never going to let the bond market go bankrupt, right? They're going to have to choose the bond market. So what do? They print more currency. This is why I say we're going to have a debt crisis, because the rest of the world is going to have to do the same thing for their bond markets. So their bond markets will blow up, or their currencies will blow up before the United States. Not because we're better or smarter. It's just that's the way the system is designed, and they don't have the drain the same way the U.S. has the drain. Japan is in this position right now. Japan has a lot of bad loans on their books, and they have a lot of zero yielding and negative yielding Japanese government bonds on the bank balance sheets, insurance company balance sheets, pension fund balance sheets. And so that's part of the reason they've kept interest rates zero. They've kept interest rates at zero. But now, because of inflationary pressures, they're wanting interest rates to go up a little bit. But the minute interest rates go up a little bit, the banking system gets in trouble, the bond market gets in trouble. So they ultimately end up printing more yen. And as a result, the yen has fallen like 30% versus the dollar in a year and a half, 2 years. That's a huge move for a currency. So again, all of these things that people are worried about one day happening to the dollar are already happening to the euro. They're already happening to the yuan. They're already happening to the ruble. They're already happening to the yen. And the list goes on and on. So it's, again, I don't want to come across as Pollyannish like we don't have anything to worry about. We have a lot to worry about. But we're not alone in that. And the rest of the world, it's hitting them before it hits the United States.
Do we start buying mortgage-backed securities again, or
probably? I would think that would be the standard play, but I don't know if it'll work the same way it will. At some point, markets get bigger than the government, but I think that's the likely playbook. The other thing that could happen is you could have a period of time where it's just think about COVID, right? Big move down, huge move back up. It was a V-shaped recovery. A year later, it was almost like it didn't even happen. You could have a 3, 4, 5 year downturn where the government just puts enough liquidity in just to keep it going, right? Where we don't have the big rebound. in which case, people lose their homes, banks get in trouble, but the government gives injections to the banks. We could have a thing where the government says, we're going to pay your mortgages, but now we own the houses. You're going to be living in our houses rather than living in your houses. Now that's a disaster, because what does that sound like? That sounds like the former Soviet Union, where you live in
California is starting to do this. No, they have this dreamers. You've heard about this?
Yeah, I used to live in California, so I hear about this all the time. And
they're now looking at a program where they will give a first-time buyer their down payment, but they become equity partners in the house. So, and that was what I was going to ask you too. Do you see that? You see the government as being fractional owners in our?
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all if we get. And this is why this ends really badly. Is like we're headed towards. I hate to use the word totalitarian or fascist, but we're getting into this thing where the government's going to own businesses, and this doesn't work well, right?
We saw this happen in the bailout of 2008.
Yeah.
What about jobs? So, I've seen some articles on people that are proponents of a government wage or, government guaranteed job. And as we're talking about them becoming owners in our real estate, what do you think? I mean, in kind of wrapping up, what do you think about the job market? Because for me, I've been saying, being in this industry for such a long time, I don't claim that I'm going to be right. I don't even care whether I'm right. I'm just trying to have a business and I help clients, and I want to be able to advise them accordingly. But one of the things, when I look at everything from a macro level, that my industry, which is what I know best, the only thing I can put my finger on other than bailouts, because you can only do that for so long. And what I mean by that is, if I bail you out from paying your mortgage, the longer I do that, what I don't know is what's in your mind. Yeah. You may be saying, well, I have some money and the roof's leaking, but I'm not going to fix that, because the minute that I stop my bailout, I'm going to leave because the house, whatever. Or even when the bailouts are there, I may leave because my house doesn't have heat, because I can't afford $25,000. So when I look at the bailouts, I say to myself, okay, I only think that will work for a certain period of time. People can disagree with me, but that will show up somewhere, unless the government's going to go in and reappraise the house and to determine if it passed the same safety inspection as when they got that government-backed loan. The only other thing that I see that has really kept us moving, and the ability for people to pay 50, 60% of their earnings, they're in debt, is our strong job market. Any thoughts on, are we going to see, we're starting to see layoffs show up. Jay Powell wants to land the plane without high unemployment. Will we see a major job crisis in the next 4 or 5 years?
You mean a loss of jobs?
Loss of jobs.
What I think we could have is, a loss of jobs with wage pressure not collapsing, because I think the government will probably let some things fail, but they will subsidize others, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know how this is going to end, but I know from history this is not going to end well. When government gets involved in everything, I feel like it's amazing to me when I think back to the time I grew up, right? I grew up in the 80s, and it was very clear that, communist systems did not function well, and they eventually go bad. And capitalism is the most efficient allocator of capital, and you let the market figure it out. And those were kind of givens, right? You didn't have to debate that too much. But now we have slipped so far away from that. And even the U.S., the once bastion of capitalism, is the government's involved in everything, and they don't know how to allocate capital. And there's always unforeseen circumstances, unintended consequences. And I just don't, this is why I think things are going to go badly, because the government, from a political perspective, cannot just step back and let things go. If they just stepped back, let things go. We'd have a horrible recession. It'd be awful. It'd be massive unemployment. And then 18 months later, everything would be fine.
We'd figure it out.
That's exactly what many people don't know this. In 1920, there was a worse crash than the crash of 1929. Warren Harding was the president. He's the most hated president in history, by the way. When you look at polls of presidents, he's always at the bottom. You know, he slashed government budget by 50%, stopped spending, didn't bail anybody out. And then what did we have after that? The Roaring 20s, a time of unprecedented growth. And it's because of the forgotten depression of 1920 where Harding just said, you know what? The market's smarter than I am. Let the market figure it out. But that's not going to happen this time. I wish it would. That's not the world we live in. I think the government is going to have to get involved in stuff. And when they do that, there will be unintended consequences. And those unintended consequences will not be positive. And
yeah. So what advice do you have for people?
So I think what I would say is if you have a job, keep it. Don't give away. If you have a good job, don't give it away. If you have a good wage, don't give it away. If you have savings, keep some in cash. I know it's very popular to say in an inflationary environment, don't hold cash. Well, you know what? Right now, you can put cash in a money market fund or a 1-month T-bill and get 5%. It wasn't that long ago where you had to buy a junk bond to get 5%. So even if you think your dollars are losing value versus inflation, having a nest egg of cash that can get you through a crisis or a downturn and allow you to sleep at night, that's very important. Even if you lose a little bit against inflation, it's important because if you are all in and you don't have any nest egg, you don't have any cash, and we get some kind of a negative economic shock, you're going to be stressed. And if you're stressed, you are not going to make good decisions. And when you need to be calm, cool, and collected in a crisis. You don't want to be jumping from one thing to another and stressed out during a crisis. And I think having a cash reserve will help you get through the crisis. I think everybody should own gold. I think that should be kind of a cornerstone of every portfolio. I think this is going to end badly. And when it ends badly, I think gold is going to put itself forward as a worthy replacement for money.
Physical,
yeah. I don't think we're going back to a gold standard. I don't think that's going to happen, but that doesn't mean that gold won't go up a lot anyway. And I think in the short term, maybe it goes down. But I don't buy gold for tomorrow. I buy gold for the crisis or 5 years or 10 years down the road. I think I know people are going to say you're crazy, but I think you should have some money in the stock market. Maybe not a lot, but you should have some because history has actually shown in times of inflation, equities do pretty well. Equities own real assets. If fiat currency is getting debased, equities tend to go high. Now, I'm not saying to just blindly go out and put all your money into the stock market, but
get with someone.
My point is I think you should have diversified investments. I would if you're kind of a labor worker and you don't have a lot of savings, definitely have a cash reserve. If you're a little better positioned and you have an investment portfolio, I would not have them overseas. I wouldn't have them in Europe. I wouldn't have them in Asia. I wouldn't have them in emerging markets. I would concentrate them in the United States, maybe by the big blue chip, dividend paying stocks that can survive a recession and pay you a nice interest rate in the meantime. But I think you got to be nimble and not. It's funny because I've been doing this for 25 years now, and I've been studying this like crazy for 15, and I don't know what's going to happen. So when I talk to people, it's like, oh, crypto's going to do great. Oh, gold's going to do great. Oh, real estate's going to do great. And they're so sure they have it figured out. I'm like, how do you have it figured out? There's no way. You might be right, but you might just be lucky. So keep an open mind. Don't be dogma. Whatever your tribe is and whatever the dogma of your tribe is, get rid of it. Keep an open mind and kind of be ready for anything.
Brent Johnson, that is amazing advice. Thank you so much.
I hope it works.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for watching this video, and I have 4 small favors to ask. First, if you liked the video, you can let Brent and I know that you did by hitting the thumbs up. And number 2, you can leave a comment below to let Brent and I know what you enjoyed most about the interview. And number 3, if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, you could consider doing so now and hit the alert bell. You'll know every time we upload content. And finally, number 4, you could share this with your family and friends, because I think that it's really important that we get this information out to as many people as we can. See you next time. Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.